Eastern Carpathians, Austro-Hungarian frontier, autumn 1894. The first frost came earlier than it should have that year, not heavy, not lasting, just enough to leave a thin white memory on the ground at dawn, gone by noon but never fully forgotten. The kind of frost that told you something was wrong long before anyone was ready to admit it. In the village of Borza Vale, people noticed something else instead. A woman digging, not in a field, not for planting, not for a root cellar, around her house. A full ring, 3 feet wide, 4 feet deep, cut into the hardening earth like a boundary that had no clear purpose. Her name was Annika Petrov, 36 years old, widowed 2 winters prior when her husband Luka failed to return from a logging run after a sudden storm sealed the upper pass.
The path is worse today.
They found him in spring, half buried, close enough to home to be cruel, far enough to change everything. Since then, Annika spoke little, worked constantly, and watched things others ignored. That last part was what unsettled people. Because quiet work can be dismissed, but careful watching, that suggests intent. By late September, the trench had become impossible to ignore. It cut a clean perimeter around her timber cabin, a rectangle of raw earth that stood out sharply against the flattened grass. Children stopped along the path to stare. Men slowed their carts. Women paused at the well and turned their heads just enough to see without appearing to look. She's building a ditch. For what? No idea. Water won't collect like that. Then what's it for? No one had an answer, so they supplied one. She's lost her sense. That was the easiest explanation. Grief, loneliness, too much time alone. All reasonable, all comforting. Because if she was wrong, then they did not need to reconsider anything. Annika worked anyway, morning until dusk, the shovel rising and falling with a steady rhythm that never changed. She did not rush, did not slow. Each cut placed, each section measured by eye, not perfect, but consistent. That mattered more. On the 3rd day, Mikhail Dobrev came to see it himself. Mikhail had built half the structures in Borza Vale, barns, roofs, foundations. If something stood through winter, it usually bore his mark somewhere in its frame. He walked the length of the trench slowly, boots pressing into the loose soil at the edge, hands clasped behind his back, studying, not dismissing. Not yet. "You've gone all the way around," he said finally. "Yes." "No gaps?" "No." He looked at her. "This is not drainage?" "No." "You are not lining it?" "No." "Then what is it?" Annika rested the shovel against her shoulder, considered him for a moment, then answered simply, "A break." Mikhail frowned. "A break in what?" She pointed toward the ground. "In that." He followed her gesture, saw nothing unusual, just soil, grass, stone beneath. "This is ground," he said. "Yes." "It does nothing." "It takes," she replied. That answer held, not loudly, but firmly. Mikhail shifted his weight. "You're saying the ground takes heat. I am saying it does not give it back." He almost smiled, almost, because the idea sounded incomplete, too simple. "You think a trench will stop that?" "I think it will slow it." "Slow is not enough in winter." "No," she agreed, "but it is more than nothing." He studied the trench again, longer this time, because what she was suggesting, it touched something he had noticed but never named. Cabins that should have been warm weren't, Floors colder than air, walls holding heat better than ground. It had always been blamed on poor wood, bad ceiling, weak fires, but never the earth itself. "You are digging too late," he said finally. "Frost will harden this before you finish." "I will finish." "You cannot outrun winter." She met his eyes. "I am not outrunning it." "Then what are you doing?" She lifted the shovel again, standing apart from it. Mikhail exhaled slowly. That answer unsettled him, because it did not argue, it did not defend, it simply existed. "I have built for 20 years, he said. "I have seen cold take good houses and bad houses the same way." She nodded. "Yes. And you think this will change that?" "I think it will change where it begins." He did not respond, because that was a different kind of claim. Not stronger walls, not bigger fires, a different starting point. That was harder to dismiss, but easier to ignore. He stepped back from the trench. "You should line it," he said, "or it will collapse." "It will hold. That is not how soil works. It is how this soil works." Confidence again. Quiet, unshaken. Mikhail nodded once, more out of habit than agreement, then turned and walked back toward the road. By the time he reached the village, the story had already grown. "She's digging a moat. For wolves? For ghosts?" Laughter followed, because laughter simplifies, turns uncertainty into something manageable. At the general store, Petru Ionescu leaned against the counter and shook his head. "She thinks she can outsmart winter." "You cannot outsmart winter," someone said. "You survive it." "Or you don't," another voice joined. "She's burying herself in work. Better than freezing. That trench won't stop anything." "No," Petru said, "but it will give us something to talk about until the snow comes." More laughter, because talking costs nothing, testing costs everything. Annika did not come to the store. She did not hear the laughter directly, but she understood it, because she knew how it looked. Unnecessary effort, unproven method, too much work for too little visible gain. That was always how change appeared in its early stages: wasteful, pointless, wrong. By early October, the trench reached full depth, 4 feet, clean edges, slight inward angle to prevent collapse. Not by instruction, by observation. She had dug smaller cuts before, seen how straight walls failed, how angled ones held. Experience teaches quietly, but it teaches well. Now came the second part, the part no one expected. Instead of leaving the trench open, she began filling it, not with soil, with straw, dry, tightly packed, layer after layer pressed down into the bottom 2 feet. Above that, pine branches, loose, irregular, creating pockets of trapped air. And above that, she placed rough planks salvaged from an old shed, laid across the trench like a narrow walkway encircling the cabin, then covered them with a thin layer of earth. From a distance, the trench disappeared. What remained was a raised ring of ground around the cabin. Not tall, not dramatic, but noticeable, different, intentional. That was when the mockery sharpened. She dug a hole just to fill it again. With straw. Straw rots. Straw burns. Straw feeds mice. She's building a nest for winter. No, Petru laughed. She's building a bed for it. The name came quickly. The Ring House. Or more simply, the Buried Widow. Annika heard that one. A boy shouted it as he ran past the road. She did not react, because names do not change outcomes. Only actions do. By late October, the first real cold wind came down from the mountains, sharp, dry, unforgiving. It carried with it the scent of snow that had not yet fallen. Mikhail stood outside his own cabin that evening, feeling the wind press against the walls. He stepped inside, closed the door, and noticed something familiar. The floor was already colder than the air. Too early, too soon. He frowned. Then, without quite knowing why, he thought of the trench, of the straw, of the idea of slowing something that had always been accepted as unstoppable. He shook his head, dismissed it, because experience is heavy, and new ideas must fight against it. Across the village, fires were lit earlier each night, wood stacks measured, plans made, adjustments considered. Everything the same, everything familiar. Except for one cabin. One quiet structure sitting inside a ring of altered ground. A small change, almost invisible, easy to ignore, until it mattered. And winter was coming to decide exactly that. By the first week of November, the ground began to stiffen. Not fully frozen, but resistant. A thin hardness that turned each footstep into a dull knock instead of a soft press. That was when most people stopped digging, stopped adjusting, stopped changing anything that had not already been finished. Because once the ground begins to set, it does not forgive mistakes. It locks them in place. Annika did not stop. She had finished the trench, finished the filling. But the trench had never been the goal. It was only the first layer, the part everyone could see. What remained was what no one had considered. She began piling earth against the outer walls of her cabin, not loosely, not casually, deliberately. Each shovelful pressed into place, compacted by hand, built upward from the base of the logs to nearly the height of the lower window frame. A sloped wall, thick at the bottom, tapering slightly as it rose. The shape mattered. Flat walls shed nothing. Sloped walls deflected. Wind did not strike them the same way. It broke, split, lost force. That was something she had learned long before, not from books, from watching storms move across open ground, from seeing how snow gathered differently against angled surfaces, from noticing how anything that resisted directly failed faster. Better to redirect, better to guide, better to let the force pass. Mikhail returned 3 days later. This time he did not announce himself. He stood at the edge of her yard and watched. She worked slowly, steadily, not rushing to finish, building something that would hold. He walked closer, boots crunching lightly against the stiffening soil. "You are burying the walls now." "Yes." "That will trap moisture." "Not if it can move." He looked closer, saw the narrow gaps she had left at intervals. Small, intentional, channels. Not enough to let wind through, but enough to let breath escape. That was unexpected. Most people sealed everything tight. Tight meant warm, or so they believed. "You are letting it breathe," he said. "Yes." "That loses heat. It loses water." He paused. That answer mattered because moisture was the quiet destroyer. Not wind, not even cold, but damp. Damp that settled, damp that lingered, damp that turned warmth into weakness. "You chose the slope for drainage," he said slowly, "and for wind." He nodded. You are solving more than one problem. She did not answer, because she was not solving problems. She was removing them, one at a time. By mid-November, the berm was complete. From a distance, the cabin no longer stood clean against the ground. It appeared lower, embedded, as if the earth itself had risen to meet it. Children said it looked like the house was sinking. Adults said it looked like a mistake. Both were wrong. It was neither. It was a barrier, a coat, a decision. That same week, the first true snow came, heavy enough to stay, not deep, but persistent. A white layer that softened edges and quieted sound. In the village, preparations accelerated. Wood stacks moved closer to doors, animals brought in earlier. Doors reinforced, windows sealed, everything as it had always been done. Everything as it had always been trusted. The first night the temperature dropped below 0, the difference began. Not visibly, not dramatically, but quietly. In Mikhail's house, the fire burned strong, the walls held, but the floor was already cold. Not freezing, but pulling, drawing warmth downward. He placed his hand against it, frowned. It should not have been that cold that early. Across the village, the same pattern repeated. Cabins that held heat in the air, but lost it through the ground. A slow theft, constant, unseen. In Annika's cabin, it did not happen. The floor remained cool, but not draining, not pulling, not demanding constant fire to compensate. That difference, that was the trench, the break, the separation. Cold moves through contact, through mass, through connection. She had interrupted that, not stopped it, slowed it, enough to matter. By the second week of November, the wind strengthened. Long, steady currents pushing down from the mountain passes, dry, cutting, relentless. It found every weakness, every gap, every flaw in construction. In the village, fires grew larger, wood burned faster. Because wind does not just cool, it steals. It strips warmth from surfaces faster than fire can replace it. Mikhail noticed it first in his workshop, a small draft near the base of the wall. Nothing visible, nothing obvious, but constant. Enough to make the tools cold to the touch, enough to turn breath visible near the floor. He sealed it, packed more fiber into the seams, closed it tight. The next night, it returned somewhere else. That was the nature of it. You do not stop wind. You chase it, endlessly. Across the slope, Annika's cabin stood differently. The wind struck the berm, not the logs. It broke against the slope, rose, passed over. What remained had lost force, lost direction, lost purpose. The walls did not feel the same pressure, did not leak the same way. Inside, the air stayed still, not perfectly, but enough. That was all it needed. By the third week, the talk changed, not entirely, but noticeably. Less laughter, more observation. They say her fire burns less. That's not possible. Everything burns more this year. Then why doesn't hers? Because she's using better wood. Or she's lying. About what? No one answered that, because the question itself was flawed. You do not lie to winter. Winter corrects you. Always. One evening, as the wind pressed hard against the village, Petru Ionescu stood outside his own door and looked toward Annika's place. Smoke rose from her chimney, thin, steady. Not the heavy plume of someone fighting to stay warm. Something else, controlled, measured. That unsettled him, because it suggested something he did not want to consider: efficiency, less effort for the same result, or worse, a better one. The next morning he rode out, not openly curious, not openly skeptical, just passing by. That was how it began. He slowed near the cabin, looked at the berm, at the way snow had begun to gather along its slope, not drifting wildly, but settling, packing, becoming another layer, another barrier, another form of insulation, unplanned, or perhaps fully expected. Annika stood outside, stacking wood. Not a large pile, smaller than most. That was the first thing he noticed. "You are not storing enough," he said. She looked at him. "It is enough." "For what?" "For what I need." "That is not how winter works." "It is." He gestured toward the wood. "You will run out." "No, you cannot know that." "I can." Confidence again, not loud, not defensive, just present. Petru frowned. "You think this," he gestured toward the ground, "will save you wood?" "It already has." He looked at the chimney, then back at her. "Less burning means more cold." "Not if the cold does not reach." That answer stayed with him longer than he expected, because it challenged something fundamental. That heat must always fight, that warmth must always be produced. She was suggesting something else: that warmth could be held, protected, maintained, not chased endlessly. He did not respond, because he did not yet believe it, but he did not laugh either. That was the change. By the end of November, the temperature dropped again, harder this time, deeper, the kind of cold that does not lift during the day, that settles into the land and holds. The village responded the only way it knew how: more fire, more wood, more effort, more strain, and still, it felt like less. Because the cold was not just outside, it was beneath, around, inside. Annika's cabin remained different, not warm, not comfortable, but stable, and stability. That was something the others were beginning to realize they did not have. Not yet, not fully, but enough to notice, enough to question, enough to begin looking again at something they had already decided was wrong, and wondering if perhaps it wasn't. December closed in without warning, not with a storm, not with a single dramatic shift, but with a steady tightening of everything that still moved. The air grew thinner, the light dimmer, the cold no longer came and went. It stayed, and when it stays, it begins to take. At first the village did what it always did, adjusted: more wood, more time near the fire, more layers, more effort. The familiar answer to an unfamiliar problem. But the problem this year was not loud. It was patient. It did not strike all at once. It worked slowly, from the ground up. In Mihail's house, the first sign came beneath the table, a small patch of frost forming along the seam between two floorboards. He noticed it one morning when the light struck it at an angle, not thick, not dangerous, just there. He crouched, touched it. It did not melt immediately. That was wrong. The fire had been burning all night. The room was warm enough. The walls held, but the floor was losing, and what the floor loses, the room must replace always. He stood, added more wood to the stove, watched the flame rise, stronger, brighter. But the frost did not retreat as quickly as it should have. That was when he understood something he had never needed to before. The fire was not only heating the air, it was fighting the ground, and the ground was winning slowly. Across the village, the same realization came in different ways. At Petru's place, the problem showed itself in his woodpile. Logs stacked near the north wall began to change. Not visibly at first, but when split, they rang differently. Too sharp, too dry on the surface, too hard within, frozen, not just cold, frozen. Wood like that does not burn clean. It resists, it cracks, it wastes heat before it gives any. Petru stood staring at the pile, then stepped inside, fed the fire again and again, because that was the only answer he knew. But each time, it felt like less, more effort, less return. At the Lundgren's house, the animals began to show it. The cow's breath froze along the interior boards overnight, not just near the walls, but closer, closer than it should have been, closer than it had ever been before. The barn held, but not enough, never enough. Each night required more, each morning revealed less. Loss did not come suddenly. It accumulated, quietly, relentlessly, and then the storm came, not the first snow, not a passing wind, a full descent, the kind that turns distance into nothing, the kind that erases paths, the kind that replaces sound with pressure. It began in the night, a low wind, then rising, then constant. By morning, the village was buried halfway up the doors. By afternoon, the wind carved the snow into walls. Drifts climbed past windows. Paths disappeared. Everything that had been known, hidden. Inside, people stayed close to their fires, fed them constantly, watched the flames as if watching something alive, because in that moment, the fire was the only thing standing between them and what waited outside and beneath. Mihail woke before dawn to a silence that did not feel right, not quiet, but muted, heavy. He stepped out of bed, placed his foot on the floor, and stopped. Cold, sharp, too sharp. He moved to the stove, added wood, waited, but the cold did not lift the way it should have. It lingered, clung, because now the ground beneath the house had fully frozen, not just at the surface, deep, reaching, pressing upward, pulling heat away faster than the fire could replace it. He understood it now, too late. Not the wind, not the walls, the ground, always the ground. Across the village, the same moment arrived. Different houses, same realization. Fires burned high, but rooms stayed cold. Wood disappeared, but warmth did not stay. Something was wrong, something deeper than what they had prepared for. And in that understanding, a memory surfaced, a trench, a break, a woman who had said, "It begins there." Mihail did not wait. He pulled on his coat, wrapped a scarf tight, and stepped into the storm. The wind hit him immediately, hard, driving snow against his face, erasing direction. But he knew the path, even when he could not see it. He moved uphill, step by step, blind, until he saw it, not the cabin, the shape of it, the rise of the earth around it, half buried, half hidden, but still, there. Smoke rose from the chimney, thin, steady, unbroken. That alone told him everything. He reached the door, knocked once, then again. The door opened. Annika stood there, calm, unhurried, as if the storm had no authority here. "You came?" she said. He nodded, breath visible, sharp. "It's worse than I thought." "Yes, you knew." "I expected." He stepped inside and stopped, because the air was different, not warm, but held, still, not fighting the cold, but not losing to it either. He looked down, the floor, not frozen, cool, but not draining. He placed his hand against the wall, solid, dry, no seep, no frost. The difference was not dramatic. It was precise, controlled, measured, and that made it more powerful than any fire. "This is it," he said quietly. "Yes, the trench, the break." He turned slowly, understanding forming fully now. "You separated the house from the frozen ground. I slowed it. You reduced the loss. I changed where it begins." He exhaled, long, because now it was clear, not just what she had done, but what they had missed. For years, they had built stronger walls, burned more wood, fought harder, but always, They had fought the wrong direction, outward, upward, never downward, never where the cold truly lived. He looked at her. We are losing wood faster than we can replace it. I know. People will not last if this continues. She said nothing, because she already knew that too. Mihail stepped back toward the door. I need to show them. She shook her head slightly. They need to see it. He paused, then nodded, because that was true. Understanding cannot be told. It must be witnessed. He stepped back into the storm, and this time he did not feel only the cold. He felt the mistake, the one they had all made, the one that had cost them more than they could measure, and for the first time, he knew where to look to fix it, not in the fire, not in the walls, but in the ground beneath their feet, the place they had trusted most and understood least, and now the storm would force them to learn, or lose everything they thought they had secured against it. The storm did not break the next day, or the day after. It held, a long grinding pressure over the valley that left no room for error and no time for pride. By the third day the village had changed, not in its shape, in its thinking. Mihail did not gather them in the square. He did not argue. He walked, from house to house. He stepped inside where he was allowed, stood in silence where he was not. And each time he asked the same question, "Where is your cold coming from?" At first the answers were the same as always, the wind, the door, the chimney, but he would shake his head, then point down, feel it, and they did, reluctantly, then carefully, then with growing unease, because once you notice it, you cannot ignore it. The cold was not entering from the sides. It was rising, steady, constant, unseen, and when they followed him, when they climbed through the drifting snow to Annika's cabin, they stopped the same way he had, at the door, at the threshold between struggle and control. Inside there was no miracle, no roaring fire, no excess, just balance, a system, a quiet answer to a loud problem. She dug around it, Mihail said simply. She broke the ground away from the house. No one laughed, not this time. Petru stepped forward first, kneeling, pressing his hand against the floor, then the wall, then the ground outside where the trench lay buried under snow. He stood slowly. "It's not warmer," he said. "No," Mihail replied. "It just doesn't lose." That was enough, because they understood. Warmth was not something you created endlessly. It was something you kept, and they had been losing it every hour through something they had never thought to question. By afternoon, the first man began digging, not because he wanted to, because he had to. The ground was hard, frozen near the surface, but beneath, it could still be broken, slowly, painfully, deliberately. Others followed, not all, but enough. They worked in silence. No jokes, no criticism, only the sound of tools striking earth. The same sound they had once mocked. Days passed, the storm weakened, not gone, but less certain, and inside the houses that had begun the work, something changed. Not immediately, not dramatically, but noticeably. The floors stopped biting, the fires held longer, the wood lasted. Small differences, but in winter, small differences decide everything. By late January, the worst had passed. No one said it out loud. They had learned enough not to trust relief too quickly. But they felt it, in the way they slept, in the way they moved, in the way they no longer watched the fire with quiet fear. And when the snow finally settled into stillness, the village looked different, not in what was built, but in what was understood. Annika did not stand in the center of it. She did not explain. She did not claim anything. She returned to her work, as she always had. Because she had never been trying to prove anything. She had simply seen something others had not, and acted on it. One evening, as the sun dropped low behind the hills, Mihail stood at the edge of his land and looked toward her cabin, half hidden, half buried, quiet. He spoke once, not loudly, not for anyone else. We were fighting the wrong enemy. The wind still came, the cold still returned. Winter did not change, but they had, and that was enough. If you've ever seen something that didn't make sense at first, but proved itself when it mattered, leave a comment and share where you're watching from.